Thank you for joining us as we remember the life and legacy of Albert Bandura. Our webinar today will feature some interactive elements, and you can use the instructions on the screen to access the polls. We'll also make that available in the chat. We want to first begin by saying that our hearts go out to our friends affected by the invasion of Ukraine. As we prepared for this webinar and watched the tragic events unfolding in Ukraine, Dr. Usher reminded us that Bandura was himself half Ukrainian, having been born to a Polish father and a Ukrainian mother. Like the brave people of Ukraine today, his work was driven by hope for the future, the ability of people to exercise their personal and collective agency to improve their lives and the lives of others. Albert Bandura received his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Iowa in 1951. His early work on social modeling provided a view of learning and behavior that challenged central tenets of psychoanalysis and radical behaviorism. He developed and refined his social cognitive theory over the course of his nearly 70-year career, reshaping the way people thought about education, medicine, sport, and business. He's widely recognized as one of the most awarded and cited psychologists in history. To describe Bandura's contributions to educational psychology, we're very fortunate to be joined by two of the leading scholars in the field, Dr. Dale Schunk and Dr. Ellen Usher. Both of our presenters won major Division 15 awards early in their careers and are now fellows in the division. Dr. Schunk is a professor in the School of Education at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where he served as dean from 2001 to 2011. He completed his dissertation under Albert Bandura in 1979, and his work examines student cognition, self-regulation, and motivation from a social cognitive perspective. He is a past president of Division 15. Dr. Usher is Chelgren Endowed Professor at the University of Kentucky, where she holds joint appointments in the Department of Psychology and the Department of Educational, School, and Counseling Psychology. She's a research director of the P20 Motivation and Learning Lab, which explores applications of Bandura's social cognitive theory to motivation in various educational contexts. According to our records, and I double-checked this, Dr. Usher also co-chaired the very first Division 15 webinar, so we in the webinar committee salute you. And with that, Dr. Usher, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. It's on behalf of Dale, I just want to say thank you to Division 15 and particularly to Jason, Chen, and David Morris for inviting us to honor Albert Bandura's legacy to psychology and education today. So because our webinar format doesn't enable us to see you, which personally drives me crazy, we have two slides embedded at the start of our presentation to help us connect to one another. So we'd love to hear from you if you have a phone or another device nearby. I'm pausing here for a moment so that you can get connected to us. So to get set up, you just need to send a text message to 22333 with my name in the text body and the number 913. It's not case sensitive. There are no spaces. You'll get a confirmation text if you're successful. So we thought we would begin with asking you to reflect on how Albert Bandura's work has most influenced you personally. So now at this point, if you're connected, text one concept from Bandura's work that's most influenced you. Great, thank you. We're gonna come back to this in a moment, but Dale and I wanted to first share our own personal relationship with Al Bandura, and as a way of sort of introducing him to you through us. So my story goes something like this. Through the clever arrangement of my own academic advisor, Professor Frank Pajares, who is pictured on the left of the centermost image on this slide, I came to meet Professor Bandura. It was the summer of 2004 on the left most picture here, when Dr. Pajares, who created and maintained a website repository for Professor Bandura's work, sent me off to my first APA conference with the charge of taking as many photos of him as possible. He was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award in Honolulu that summer. So I stalked the stage of the 1,000 plus filled person ballroom, and I was able to grab a few photos, none of which met the standards of Dr. Pajares, unfortunately, after which I joined the long line of enthusiastic fans waiting to meet Professor Bandura. And he generously stood there, greeting each person and posing for photos for as long as there was a line. And it was because of Frank Pajares that Albert Bandura came to know me. When Dr. Pajares passed away suddenly in 2009, I began looking over Professor Bandura's website on his behalf. and part of which Professor Bandura and I later migrated to Stanford. You've probably visited it at some point if you're here. Then, I just want to point out it would be easy for a renowned scholar like him to dismiss an early career researcher like me, but that's not at all what happened. Professor Bandura hosted me twice in Palo Alto and later supported my promotion and tenure at the University of Kentucky. I'll always be amazed by his generosity and his support of graduate students and young scholars and his excellent sense of humor. This picture on the right was my last visit with him in 2013, where he had just shown me the legal pad on which he had just scribed 80 pages, what turned out to be 80 typed pages, a full chapter of his book on moral disengagement. Dale's going to tell now his story of how he came to know the professor in a different way.
Thank you, Alan. I first met Al Bandura in the mid 1970s, actually. And when I went to Stanford as a doctoral student in the Psychological Studies and Education program. And I took a course called Principles of Behavior Change. And at the end of the course, I went and talked to him because we had talked about self-efficacy. And this is when he was doing early research on it. And I asked him, I said, this sounds like a great concept to apply to education. Had he ever thought about doing that, or would he be interested in that? And he was. And so, to make a long story short, he ended up being my dissertation chair as we did the first study investigating self-efficacy in an educational context involving student learning. And subsequently, after my dissertation, then I worked for him as an RA for a year. We did a follow-up study on goal setting. He was, Al had very high standards. He practiced what he preached. And he talked about modeling and self-regulation. I learned a lot from him about doing those things. And he never gave up on me, even though at times I'm sure he was disappointed in me. But I made it through thanks to his guidance. And I learned a lot. As I say, he had high standards. He was rigorous, but he was a very kind man. He talked in a very soft voice and never yelled or screamed. But when he said something, you listened. When I'd meet with him, I'd set up the sessions for late in the afternoon. And I said, at the end of those sessions, I was too worn out cognitively and emotionally to do anything that night. So I would always plan to go out that night and, take it easy, and said, I'll get to work on it the next day, because he would give me a long laundry list of stuff I had to work on that would last about 2 weeks. So anyway, that's how I got to meet him and how I worked with him and have known him through the years. Thanks.
Thank you, Dale. And so now I think at this point, let's turn toward Professor Bandura's chief contributions to educational psychology. And we're going to turn back to you now. If you didn't get a chance to participate earlier, you can do so in this poll. So now we'll ask, what one concept from Professor Bandura's work has most influenced educational practice in your view? So as these come in, I'll just tell you that as Dale and I were preparing for the webinar today, we also kind of asked ourselves, if we were putting together a top 5 list of contributions, what would be in our top 5? And you can imagine what the top 5 are here, the largest words, and maybe you'll see some similarity between your own lists and ours, and maybe some differences. So with that, thank you for your input, and we're going to proceed by giving you our own top 5 lists of how Albert Bandura's work has had an impact on our field. The first key contribution made by Bandura to the field of educational psychology is the emphasis on human agency. As he wrote in 2018, the metacognitive capability to reflect on the nature of oneself and the adequacy of one's capabilities, thoughts, and actions is the most distinctly human core property of agency. Bandura's social cognitive theory represented a departure from dominant psychological theories of the early 20th century, such as behaviorism, which contended that human behavior can be explained and predicted solely by changes to the environmental antecedents and consequences. Many still subscribe to this view of behaviorism today. From this view, to increase, say, a student's learning and skill development, we would discuss how best to present information and reinforce desired outcomes, what changes we might need to make to the physical environment or the social environment, how to provide appropriate rewards and punishments, how to sanction undesired behaviors. But a view that put the human in the driver's seat stood in stark contrast to these theories dominant in the 20th century. Such theories viewed stimuli and reinforcers from the environment solely as the determinants of behavior, but Bandura challenged this notion by noting that people have acquired an advanced symbolizing capacity that enables us to transcend the social pressures of our immediate environments and gives us power to shape our environment and our life courses. By our own cognitive processes, we humans are able to be proactive, to think ahead and reflect, to create more suitable environments for ourselves, to select or ignore certain information, and to regulate our thoughts and actions. As he said it, this means that people are at least partial architects of their own destinies. By the way, he found out that he was going to be president of APA while he was standing atop this mulberry tree. So Bandura advanced the social cognitive interactional framework to explain human functioning in terms of three primary modes of influence. How we function psychologically and behaviorally, he argued, is the result of this process of triadic reciprocality, in which behavioral, environmental, and personal factors dynamically interact. For example, a student who's confident in her ability to succeed academically may choose to apply to a prestigious college, thereby influencing her learning environment and her future skills and opportunities. And many of you will be familiar with this, in the realm of personal influence, we're talking about motivational influences, affective ones, and cognitive influences, as well as the ones we're born with, the biological influences such as age, sex, and natural abilities or physical health. These factors can influence one another as well, which is why I have a little reciprocal loop here, such as when a belief that failures are insurmountable leads us to feel depressed. On the behavioral side, we're often interested in outcomes such as self-regulation, performance, career choice. But these include a range of behaviors, including things like health-promoting behaviors. And in terms of the social impact of social cognitive theory, Bandura accorded a prominent role to the environment in the way in which contextual factors affect these processes. For example, we might ask how a webinar format like this one affects your motivation and learning compared to how you might be receiving our words if we were all together in person, which I kind of wish we were. Bandura differentiated among several types of agency that are required to attain one's goals. So first, at the individual level, people exercise personal control through the mechanism of forethought and self-reaction, self-reflection. But people aren't always able to have direct control over their circumstances. In certain social conditions, people have to rely on socially mediated agency by requesting the assistance of others who have the resources, knowledge, or means to act on their behalf, such as when institutional barriers get in the way. It sometimes helps to know someone else. Therefore, we rely on proxy agents to help us achieve our goals as well. And the third type of agency comes about in circumstances when individual efforts are insufficient to achieve our shared goals. By working together as a group to exercise collective agency, people can achieve their shared goals that no one would have been able to achieve alone. At this moment, we see a powerful example of collective agency among the Ukrainian people who are trying to maintain their country. Bandura emphasized that a blend of all three types of agency is necessary to manage the changing circumstances in which we find ourselves. So this is Bandura's first and foremost contribution, human agency, providing a psychological framework that underscores our agentic capacity no matter what our circumstances. But having agentic capacities and putting them to use are two different things. As Dale will explain next, Bandura outlines the psychological mechanisms by which people learn to exercise control over their lives.
Thank you, Ellen. As Bandura said about vicarious learning, learning would be extremely laborious, not to mention hazardous, if people had to rely solely on the effects of their own actions to inform them what to do. Fortunately, most human behavior is learned observationally through modeling. You can do the next one. So a major contribution was in the area of vicarious learning, which is simply is learning in the absence of overperformance at the time learning occurs. And vicarious learning is very common. It happens all the time. It happens in many ways. The pictures shown here are from Bandura's early work on the Bobo doll studies. And you have to remember at the time that he started, the behaviorism was the dominant focus. Behaviorism said that in order for learning to occur, the action had to be performed and it had to be reinforced. And what Bandura showed through his research was that learning could occur without performance at the time, and that reinforcement was not necessary. So take a look at the next one, the sources of vicarious learning. Of course, we have live models as well as symbolic models, online, televised, in print. So Bandura identified three functions of modeling. One level is called response facilitation. That just means that a response becomes more likely to happen by observing in other people. That's like you're walking down the street and a bunch of people are standing there looking out and you stop and you look up too. It's just facilitating that response. Inhibition, disinhibition is when models can either inhibit or disinhibit action through what they do. So students in the classroom, they start talking to one another and the teacher doesn't stop it. And before you know it, everybody's talking. And then the teacher might single out one student and say, get back to work, in which case then the class suddenly quiets down. That's an example then of the behavior being inhibited. Vicarious learning occurs when actually new learning takes place that the individual could not do before. Let me do the next slide. He identified processes of vicarious learning. To learn, we have to attend to the input. We have to rehearse and try to attempt to retain the information. Motivation helps because it helps us attend to models and try to learn what we're seeing, and in some cases then actually produce the desired behavior. Okay, next one. Researchers have identified some key model characteristics, because not all models are equally effective. Perceived similarity is an important one. We're more likely to emulate the behaviors of models who we feel are similar to us in important ways. Number of models, more models can be more influential because of greater likelihood that we'll perceive at least one similarity to at least one of the models. And finally, mastering coping. Mastering models demonstrate faultless performance from the outset. Coping models initially demonstrate difficulties, but through persistence, effort, use of good strategies, they overcome their issues and they perform as well as the mastery models. Next slide. And modeling can be used not just for behaviors, but also for cognitive skills. Teacher may explain and demonstrate how to use certain mathematical formulas, for example. It can be used to teach affective skills, such as empathy with others. And there's been a lot of research done on motor skill learning, which has been very influential as far as how models come into play then. So overall, the work on vicarious learning helped to establish an important cognitive element in the ability to learn that certainly had been missing from the behavioristic views. Okay. Another important contributions of Banduras was in work in self-efficacy. As he said, among the mechanisms of agency, none is more central or pervasive than beliefs of personal efficacy. Unless people believe they can produce desired effects by their actions, they have little incentive to act. Efficacy belief, therefore, is a major basis of action. Self-efficacy, typically defined as one's perceived capabilities for learning or performing actions at designated levels. And it's a content-specific construct. As Bandura originally conceived of it, it was assessed at the level of individual tasks, one's perceived capabilities for performing certain kinds of operations and skills. Next slide, please. Efficacy is a belief. It is distinct from actual ability or actual skill, and they may not be consistent. For example, a student could tell a teacher, I can't do that, whereas in fact, the teacher knows that the student can do that. But it's the belief, the student's belief, that may then have the more powerful effects, because the student doesn't believe that he or she could be successful, may not try the task. Okay, next slide. It fits in the model as a personal factor that can influence both behavior and environment, and in fact be infected by them. Next slide. Where does efficacy come from? Well, different sources. Of course, in active experience, what we do is an important consideration. Generally, what we've been able to do, we feel capable of doing. What we haven't, we don't. But vicarious experience is also important. We learn from observing others. And if we see especially similar others engaging in the task, we may be more likely to say, well, if they can do it, I can do it, for example. And the same with forms of social persuasion or encouragement, for example. Both of these forms, even though they can raise efficacy, need eventually to be validated by performance, because they're not based on actual performance. And finally, physiological reactions. Our bodies give us some information about efficacy. If we have to address a large group of people and we feel very anxious, then we might say, gee, I don't think I can do this. I don't feel capable about doing this. Whereas if we feel less anxious, then we may feel a higher sense of efficacy. Self-efficacy can affect motivation, or choice of activities, effort, and persistence. It's been shown in several studies to affect actual learning, as well as self-regulation. And self-efficacy is related to, but not the same as other constructs. It's not the same as motivation. In fact, there are many variables that comprise motivation. Self-efficacy is one, and an important one, but it's not the only one. Other important motivational values include values, interests, for example, and a number of other variables that have come into play. Self-efficacy is also a component of self-regulation. But again, self-regulation includes a lot more. It includes strategies, it includes goal setting, includes monitoring, and other things. Bandura talked about outcome expectations, which are our beliefs about the perceived outcomes of actions, what we think might happen as a result of what we do. They're often related to efficacy because efficacious students expect positive outcomes, but they don't necessarily have to be the same, especially as he talked about that if the environment is not responsive, then in fact, we may hold positive efficacy but sort of negative outcome expectations. We don't think what we do will make much difference. And finally, there's self-concept. Self-concept is a very general variable, refers to our overall perceptions of ourselves. Certainly, self-efficacy contributes to that, but self-concept is a far broader construct. And research typically shows that efficacy bears a stronger relationship to performance because it's typically assessed at the level of more specific tasks. So those are some of the major points that Bandura talked about with self-efficacy. I love that picture, by the way. You got to go back in the archives to get that one. I never knew him when he was that young. But he talked about self-regulation. And he said another distinctive feature of social cognitive theory is the central role it assigns to self-regulatory functions. People do not behave just to suit the preferences of others. Much of their behavior is motivated and regulated by internal standards and self-evaluative reactions to their own actions. Self-regulation refers to one's cognitions, behaviors, and affects that are systematically directed toward attainment of one's goals. And in the model of the reciprocal interactions, that self-regulation includes both personal and behavioral variables. We can regulate factors about ourselves, and we can also regulate aspects of the environment. Now, one thing that Bandura did in the early days of self-regulation, again, it was based more on reinforcement theory, and it talked about such processes as self-monitoring, self-instruction, and self-reinforcement. But Bandura reconceptualized it and built in, you can do the next slide, built in more of the cognition here, where he talked about self-observation, self-judgment, and self-reaction. And then other investigators, next slide, for example, such as Barry Zimmerman, conceptualized of self-regulation as in a cyclical fashion. Forethought was what we do before we engage in the task, performance while we're working, and reflection during pauses and when the task is finished. And so some of the key sub-processes, and of course, many of these are cognitive processes or affective processes. In forethought, for example, where we set goals and decide on the strategies we're going to use and have a sense of efficacy that we can be successful. While we're working, we monitor what we're doing, we implement strategies, and importantly, check on our goal progress. And that's a key variable, because if we believe that we're making progress toward our goals, that helps to keep us motivated, engaged in the task, which in turn affects our level of efficacy and motivation. And in the periods of reflection, we evaluate how well we're doing and how satisfied we are, and we make attributions or perceived causes for the outcomes of our actions. So again, Bandura certainly, in his work, certainly have infused a heavy cognitive element into the social cognitive perspective on self-regulation that many investigators then have applied quite well in various kinds of contexts. The last point I want to talk about is Cern's idea about how do we become self-regulated? And the idea here is that initial social influences on self-regulation, such as models, mentors, instructions, and things we read about, etc., become, in fact, self-influences through the process of internalization. Internalization is simply the idea that we take a process, we adapt it, we modify it, and it becomes our own, so that we can then use it very often, very well. that allows people then to do what Bandura said in that quote, namely they become more agentic and they take greater control of their own lives when they in fact can internalize self-regulatory influences. So those are three of the, I think, major contributions: vicarious learning, self-efficacy, and self-regulation, that his work has had, not only in psychology, but many other fields as well, including education, business, health, motor skill development, and the like.
So the fifth point that I'd like to bring up for us as a major contribution from Albert Bandura, and one that I don't think I saw in large number in our earlier polling of you, is moral disengagement. I spoke earlier about Bandura's emphasis on human agency, and Dale did as well. But I also pointed out that Bandura cautioned that agentic capability doesn't come with a built-in value system. It can be used for humane or inhumane purposes. Some of you attending may recall that Bandura was among the people who attended the Self-Research Conference in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 2006. I was ever the low stalking graduate student at that time, and I had the good fortune of somehow accompanying Professor Bandura across campus. And as we neared our destination, we stopped in the middle of this large grassy area. And I don't remember the context that this came up, but essentially he described the cartoon on this slide to me. And he was describing the whole thing in detail. And as he told me the punchline, "You have humans," he laughed and laughed. And I tried to process what it meant and why he was telling me this. And I quickly came to understand that whether through his sense of humor or through his writings, Bandura has always been very concerned about the power humans have to alter their environmental circumstances for better or for worse. He was concerned about human rights, social and environmental justice. He sought to bring his psychological theory to bear on the issues that concerned him the most, and these included the destruction of the natural environment, climate change, inhumane practices bred by social injustices, corporate greed, gun violence, just to name a few. And specifically, he used the social cognitive theoretical analysis to describe the ways in which people compromise their moral standards when faced with ambiguous moral predicaments so that they can maintain a positive view of themselves, a process that he called moral disengagement. Although Bandura wrote about this in his early theorizing, in fact, I was reading his 1986 book earlier this week and noticed that much of the framing of moral disengagement that he wrote about in the last decade came from there. He really dedicated so much of the last 10 years in his own energy to address social problems using social cognitive theory and the way that moral disengagement has affected human society and life on the planet as we know it. And so I'll briefly touch on this social cognitive theory of morality, which may be less familiar to some of us in Division 15, but it parallels much of what we've already been saying in terms of Bandura's theoretical contributions to our field. First, moral agency, he argued, can take two forms. People exercise agency when they refrain from behaving in immoral or inhumane ways. This is called the inhibitive type. But they also exercise proactive moral agency by showing compassion for the plight of others, other humans and others in the more than human world. And using many of the same processes that Dale just described, Bandura explained that people exercise moral agency in part by engaging in a process of moral self-regulation. As they interact with their environments, people develop and adopt personal moral standards that guide and deter their behavior. When their behavior meets these self-set standards or their social approval, people feel good. And when it doesn't, they can regulate themselves by imposing moral self-sanctions. As he wrote, there's no more devastating consequence than self-contempt. However, Bandura noted that the acquisition of moral standards is only half the story in the exercise of moral agency. In reality, our personal standards Our self-regulatory behaviors and environmentally imposed problems often take place in complex, ambiguous environments. For example, the context of the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way that people felt about themselves and others, and it changed the way we might think about what the optimal conditions of learning are. So as people grapple with these complex problems and situations, they invoke a social cognitive process of choosing courses of action given the inhibitive and proactive forms of agency I just described. What should I do? And rather than responding in accordance with a set of predetermined moral standards, Bandura argued that people can choose to behave in different ways by selective activation and disengagement of self-sanctions. So doing so helps us mitigate the cost of feeling bad about ourselves when we behave in ways that don't align with our standards. As we see here, two individuals with the same set of moral standards may choose different courses of action given this cognitive process. Bandura described several mechanisms of moral disengagement, which can occur at any of 4 levels that I'll describe here. At the behavioral level, people can engage in moral justification, advantageous comparison, euphemistic language. At the personal level, or at the level of the self, they can displace responsibility or diffuse it. It wasn't my fault. I just am part of a system. It's what I have to do. At the level of outcomes, people can misconstrue them or minimize the consequences or even ignore them. It's just not a big deal. And at the level of the victim, we can engage in dehumanization or attribution of blame. I think in the rhetoric of today's news cycle, it's easy to see these mechanisms in use, but Bandura was clear. All of us take part in these various forms of moral disengagement in certain facets of our lives. I don't want us to get down on this because I think the point here is that as we realize this powerful agentic capacity that we have, Bandura was hopeful that we humans could understand our own psychological process and engage in morally just practices to help other people in our world. In fact, in one of what you see here is in one of his last collaborations with Lynn Cherry, he highlighted the way that a youth movement for environmental justice has put social modeling to work to affect large-scale environmental changes. It was his optimistic vision for our capacity for human betterment that prompted him to write his final opus on morality, which, along with his many other contributions to psychology, landed him a National Medal of Science by President Obama in 2016, the nation's highest honor for achievement in leadership in advancing science. He wrote that the overriding message of self-efficacy theory is enablement, not personal blame. And so that, I think, is the spirit of Bandura that I wish to carry forward in our work by enabling others, and very much hits an optimistic note. So we've been through our own top 5, and hopefully we certainly hit on some of yours and maybe extended a little bit of your understanding of Bandura's own theorizing. And as we close, we want to honor Bandura's mother and his national Ukrainian heritage, along with the people of Ukraine who are putting their own collective agency to work. Bandura wrote that seeing common humanity in others arouses empathy and compassion toward them. It also instills a sense of shared responsibility for the quality of life in a society. And in the chat here, if it's not been shared yet, it will be. We've put together a Google Doc of organizations that you and we can support as a division for helping the people in Ukraine as they go through this crisis. And in addition, I just want to share 3 other charities that Bandura gave to and put forward as in the final years of his life. The Natural Resources Defense Council, the Population Media Center, and Young Voices for the Planet. So we'll share these and some other resources with you here in the chat. And this is the way that Bandura would often sign off on books that graduate students would bring to him. Maybe you have the good fortune of having one of these books. He would write, "May the efficacy force be with you," and we send the same message to all of you today. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to having a discussion with you now.
Thank you very much, Ellen and Dale. We have a couple of questions that we can pose to you. The first one is coming from a person who's asking, could the presenters perhaps discuss a bit about how Bandura's 5 key contributions apply in online learning and teaching environments? Do they say full applicability? Do they see adaptations? What ways?
There's been a lot of research has been done already on self-efficacy for online learning. And it certainly brings to bear many variables that are not present in face-to-face. Self-regulation becomes very important, especially if it's an asynchronous course and students are on their own to complete the work and stay up with it. So I think the ideas that he expressed are very relevant, and researchers have applied them in a variety of contexts and continue to do so.
I second that.
David, you just popped on. Would you like to ask the next question?
So there's somebody else who wondered if you could both comment on the subtle ways that moral disengagement can occur, especially as it applies to self-regulation. That is the individual and collective effects.
David, could you read that question one more time? What are the individual and collective effects of moral disengagement on self-regulation?
Especially as it applies, I'll read it again. It can also be found in the Q&A at the bottom. But the person just said, I wonder if you could comment on the subtle ways that moral disengagement can occur, especially as it applies to self-regulation. I mean, those are 2 related things. That is the individual and collective effects.
My wheels are turning on that one.
Choose not to engage. That's always an option. Or choosing to engage very half-heartedly. Still requires self-regulation, of course, but not of a very intensive quality.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there is, in terms of a collective effect on self-regulation or the moral disengagement, there's certainly an environmental contagion effect of, well, no one else is doing it. No one else is really recycling around here, or no one else looks at where their clothes are made before they buy them, or, like, I'm just thinking of all the ways that we can sort of socially influence one another in our shared collective moral disengagement in our lives. It can be hard to be the lone regulator of one's behaviors when the social pressures are going in another direction. So that's what comes to mind for me at the moment. It's a great question I'll have to think about.
Yeah, thanks, Dale, and thanks, Owen. It occurs to me that one of the first things that Albert Bandura talked about in terms of the mechanisms of engagement and disengagement was about social, moral, and economic justification. And I feel like, to your point, Ellen, about, it's hard to be the lonely person, in a position. And sometimes I think this is why a lot of times leaders will advocate for a particular action using social justification, moral justification, economic justification. And I think that those oftentimes help people to latch on to something and go, well, so-and-so leader said this, and it sounds like a reasonable reason to me. So those seem like really powerful ways, and subtle too, to really do that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jason. It makes me think of just the vaccine drives over the last couple of years, and the way that we're trying to get people to make to engage morally in their decision making for the betterment of society. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, we're coming off a day off of the State of the Union address, and I mean, that right there is like all sorts of social, economic, and moral justifications for things that help people to go, oh, yeah, that's why I would support that.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Let me see here. Someone just posted a question, and this person just is saying that I am in awe of Bandura's work. I wonder, however, if there are any key criticisms of his work.
Well, I know that I would be interested in reading that. And I was just thinking the other day, I was coming across some criticisms of circumstances in which I think I came across a paper that was exploring entrepreneurial self-efficacy. So this is people's self-efficacy for starting a new business. And it was a review study that I haven't read thoroughly, so I can't comment much on it. But one of the kind of concluding arguments is that perhaps self-efficacy is not the best variable to look at when we are thinking about why do people start a business venture. So I think there are circumstances in which certain social cognitive variables may not play as big a role as perhaps I don't think Bandura would disagree with that, though. I think he would fully agree with that. So I don't know of a major criticism of social cognitive theory. Dale, how would you respond to that?
Well, one thing is that sometimes self-efficacy gets elevated way beyond where it should be. I've had people say to me, well, efficacy is the major variable controlling behavior. And they say, well, I don't really think it is. I said, I think it's more like what skill you have, what you can do is going to determine what you do. If you don't know how to do something, you're not going to do it no matter how high your efficacy is, frankly. So I think, it's an important variable, but it's not the only one. We can feel very efficacious about doing things, but if we don't value them, if we have no interest in them, if we don't care about the consequences, then we're not going to bother. It's simply pure and simple. There are certain aspects of Bandura's theory that haven't been explored in great depth. I don't know if I call them weaknesses or just areas that need more exploration. The whole area, for example, about information processing. And of course, there are theories of information processing, but you don't find a whole lot of that in social cognitive theory. Same way with issues regarding human development. Developmental psychologists have studied that in depth, and they have a lot to say. Well, you read social cognitive theory, and you don't get that kind of a depth of understanding. So again, I don't know, I call them weaknesses. I just say those are areas that need to be further developed within the theory.
And I would add to that I think as Dale alluded to, so elements of social cognitive theory can be narrowly read and conclusions drawn based on a narrow set of their use in certain studies. I think where I see social cognitive theory being useful for future research is in exploring new contextual factors and conditions under which to test whether these things are working in ways that were theorized. So there are so many conditions under which we haven't examined social cognitive theoretical variables.
So it looks like we have one last question, then we probably need to close. But this last one's, I think, interesting given, when Bandura was really talking about things like the Bowenall, et cetera, and aggression and media. And they're really asking about, what do you think about what's going on today? So this is the question. What is the media's responsibility in the realm of learning the graphical content of violence in all forms of media and ease of access for the young? Where do you think Bandura would stand on that?
Question again. Can you repeat it, David?
Sure. So he said, another question would be the media's responsibility in the realm of learning the graphical content of violence in all forms of media and ease of access for the young. Where would Bandura stand on that?
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would encourage folks who are interested to do is to reread an autobiography that Bandura wrote of his life's work. I was looking it over today. It was written in 2007, so he still had a good 15 years remaining, but he was reflecting on the tense years of the 1970s and how the Bobo doll experiment and other things led to his testimony on Capitol Hill about the effects of televised violence on children. And I think some of his reflections then would be pertinent today. Of course, he was also a little prescient in that he could already see the way that electronic media were affecting learners and families and people differently. In that same autobiography, he makes the comment that mobile device, that the workplace has become essentially fused with the home life and vacation, that you can always take. This was in 2007, this was a long time ago. Think about it now, where many of us are sitting, maybe in our homes right now at work. So he was concerned about that and about the lack of separation. That's not necessarily a comment on televised violence, but with the advent of video games and increasingly more compelling virtual displays of violence, does beg questions for future research about the effects of those on violent behavior.
Yeah, it gives a sense of legitimacy to it. I mean, if you watch online videos, for example, you say, well, other people are doing these things and they must be okay. It's through the process of social comparison. Then you say, well, okay, it seems to be an okay thing to do. So it's creating in that sense, a false sense of legitimacy because of its frequency. And if these things are being posted in various places.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we are at time actually for the webinar. Dr. Schunk, Dr. Usher, thank you so much for sharing your personal stories of Bandura. We loved hearing that. It's a unique perspective that we got to hear from you, and that was awesome. Thanks also for giving us a nice overview of what kind of legacy Bandura's work has left, both for the community in education and also the community in psychology. The way that his work on moral engagement and disengagement speaks to the most pressing issues that we face today is so timely. And I hope folks on this webinar will visit the sites that Dr. Usher showed us on our last slide. Remember, we have posted a link in the chat, and so you can open that Google document and you can access those links from there. So I hope folks will visit those sites, especially given the crisis that's happening in Ukraine. Everybody, thank you so much for attending the webinar. You'll be able to find a recording of this webinar on the Division 15 website, probably in about a day or two. And so we look forward to you engaging with this content there as well. So thanks again. Thanks for attending. And Dr. Usher and Dr. Schunk, thanks for speaking. Bye.
Thank you.